Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for turning out. I'm going to be quiet in a moment, but just as a very quick introduction, my name is Bill Mackay, who kind of leading this particular section of the European Atlantic Group. The European Atlantic Group was established many years ago and has some very prestigious people in it. And if you look back the history, there's a very interesting history there. A lady called Elma Dangerfield, who was very instrumental in setting it up. And I had the privilege of meeting her about 20 years ago when I first joined the European Atlantic Group. And then shortly after that, I actually got a book about the history of MI6 as a birthday present. I was looking through it and suddenly realized Elma Dangerfield had an entire chapter in that book devoted to herself. She had an amazing background. And I think her thinking behind the European Atlantic Group, along with other people involved, was to just be a source of thinking through the future for humanity, what was going on. She was largely instrumental in bringing to attention of people what was happening with atrocities during the Second World War, and was very lucky to have very good people who supported her in that. She died about 10 years ago. There's other people who know her better than me that will correct me as to exactly when. And since then, it's kept going, but we're trying to revitalize it. And there's various sections of it, and this is one of them. And so tonight, we're very, very lucky to have Amanda Bucklow as the first speaker of this new division of it, dispute resolution section. And so we do have a range of people here tonight, and I think we've got people at all levels of their career and interest in dispute resolution. Everybody's people from vocational training right through to extremely experienced, and Amanda's aim is really to be of relevance to everyone in that this evening, particularly in relation to looking at exactly what's happening in the world today and how a mediator can be of particular benefit. It's so topical just now. We've just had the G7 summit, the NATO meeting. And so Amanda's experience is wide and extremely valuable. And we're just looking forward to some insights from you, Amanda, as to things we can think about for the future. And so with that, just to remind everyone, please, we are recording, so you are agreeing to being recorded, and there will be questions at the end. And I think with that little just context, I'm going to leave it over to you, Amanda, please.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and welcome to all of you who've taken time to attend this event, especially on a Friday evening. It's lovely to see familiar faces, and it's also very nice to meet some new people as well. And I would invite you to think, as I'm speaking, what is it that you would like to know? Because as you'll appreciate, it's important that, for me, that you get something valuable out of this session. And in order to do that, I really do invite you to ask me questions which, if I don't know the answer to, I will say so, but hopefully I'll be able to give you my perspective on your particular interest. There has been an introduction to me, but I would just like to say a little bit about why I'm so interested in this particular field. We are facing really, really difficult times, and I don't know that there's going to be any kind of let-up in terms of the challenges that we have, both as individuals and in our professional lives. It seems that the capacity for division increases, and for those of us who are committed to playing something of a role in society in some way, shape or form, it is important that we are constantly reviewing the way in which we turn up, how we turn up, and how we work with people who perhaps have fewer skills or are less able. And to that end, I have huge regard for justice and law in protecting individuals against wrongs. Equally, I am committed to helping people take responsibility and make choices where they can And that's principally the role of a mediator. And I would like to share with you some insights and thoughts and even some data on where the role of mediator and diplomat, how complementary they are, but how actually very different they are in terms of approach and, if you like, agenda. So if I might just share my screen, I will. So the title, for purposes of all titles, is "Can a mediator reach places that a diplomat cannot?" And of course, having asked the question, you will very reasonably imagine that the answer is yes. So I'd like to set the context for that premise. And the first point is looking at what is the landscape for mediators and diplomats, and where does that overlap? What skills does a mediator bring? And what can politicians learn from the complementary roles of mediator and diplomat? So that's my kind of sketch. And as with any plan, it's so that you know when the plan's not working. So if I see people nodding off, then I will change course, or you can flag up. My first premise is that people do not want peace. And that might seem a bit shocking. For some people, it might not. But in my experience over the best part of 3 decades, people don't, it's not peace that people want. In fact, peace has a bit of baggage. It's often used as a phrase, say, rest in peace. It's kind of something out there that you aim towards, but you don't necessarily want it when you've got it. And I'm going to put some flesh around what I mean by people do not want peace. And of course, I'm very happy to have pushback on that assertion. So peace generally means the absence of conflict. In practice and in my experience, it's people want vindication. They want to know that they are right. And depending on who they are, they will pay a great deal of attention to being right, as opposed to doing the right thing. The vindication is very important, but peace or the absence of conflict is about access to opportunities. And I'm put in mind of my father during the Second World War, who, because of his age and what he had to do, he wasn't called up, he was too young. But his education was cut short and he didn't go to university. So arguably that conflict prevented him from accessing the opportunity to go to university. And that, when you get down to the grassroots, the access to opportunities and the access, if you like, to fairness even, if you want to go deeper, is probably a more powerful motivating force than the attention of peace. So looking at the peace accords, it's interesting that an economist at the University of Oxford called Paul Collier, his research has shown that, that 40% of all post-conflict arenas have reverted to violence within a decade. That's quite a high number when you think about it. So the peace accords that are actually negotiated at a high level are not enduring. Now, there might be many reasons for that, but it is something that we should consider. What are we doing? How are we going about it? And is it working? So peace accords fail in part because of the automatic, faultless use of templated technocrat top-down measures. That's quite a strong assertion there. It comes from a lady called Séverine Autesserre, and she wrote a book published this year, called The Front Lines of Peace. And it's not an attack on peacekeepers, etc., but it's a really rather thoughtful analysis of what we're doing and what we might do better. And it's this top-down approach, which comes principally from the fact that it needs to be organised, needs to be monitored. The donors and the sponsors of these peace accords need to know what's going on. So looking at the interventions that might happen, well, when you talk to people who have had peacekeeping, peace building activities, either by the UN or other peacekeeping forces, then their response in interviews has been that the interveners' behaviour reminded them of what their grandparents and grandparents said colonialism felt like. And the words they use are demeaning, dehumanizing, and infuriating. And this speaks to what we as mediators know to be true, is that an imposed decision is very rarely as successful as one which is agreed upon through conversation and negotiation. This is quite an important point, which I'd like you to bear in mind, several threads to pull together. Our goal is often the democratisation, and that is represented in terms of the proof that things are improving in a particular arena of conflict, is that election takes place. Well, according to figures, elections double the risk of civil war resuming. Now, if you think about that, that might be a bit shocking, but here's the underpinning reasons. Democratic elections produce a winner and a loser, and the loser is left to deal with the humiliation of having lost. The most powerful emotion that we experience as human beings, well, you might say love, but actually it's humiliation, and people do very serious things in the name of avoiding humiliation and when they've been humiliated. So in the arenas of conflict, when they're simplified into binary positions, i.e. parties or winners, losers, in this case, I'm proposing that you've got a winner and a loser, it shifts into them and us. And so the problem that existed in the beginning is just pushed in down and deeper. And it might be years or less, but it might be years before that bubbles to the surface again, because the underlying issues have not been resolved. Maybe they never can, but that's important. In dealing with these things, we talk about best practice, and a lot of people who study peace building and peace keeping, there are certain best practices, and one of the things that is worth thinking about is that who's that best for? Very often it's kind of Western business model of standardized business management practices, and then they are applied to unique human dynamics, geography, culture, and identity. And that is, if that is true, then it's possibly why those interviewed post peacekeeping events actually feel that it's another version of colonialism. These are all propositions for you to think about. When I look at best practice, I just want to bring it back sort of from the international conflict arena, bring it back to something sort of closer to home. And in the wake of many unsuccessful employment claims and difficulties and a lot of lobbying, the formal grievance procedure was introduced, and quite rightly that people should have a proper access to approaching their grievances. And I just want to put two things side by side in order to explain to you why mediation is so different from a formal process, whether that's a formal process of dispute resolution or a formal process of negotiating peace accords. Looking two things the process or the procedure in the case of grievance and how long it takes. So in the grievance, you have a complaint that's made, and then there's an investigation. Now, interestingly, more often than not, the investigation takes place or is undertaken by somebody in the same organisation. It may be from a different department or even a different geographic area. Generally speaking, the desire to keep the problem in-house makes people lean towards having somebody from the company and that is independent of those people. The three outcomes to that grievance is it's upheld, it's not upheld, or it's partly upheld. And in my experience, there are very few grievances that are just unilaterally upheld. They do happen, but they're not as common as a combination of all three. The difficulty with that is that the claimant or the complainant doesn't feel vindicated. And they can only actually see the not upheld and the partly upheld. And so if they feel very strongly about it and they've had the time to bed down in it, then there's an appeal. And if you look at the time taken, it is not unusual for that process to take around 6 months. It can be quicker, but generally speaking, and that's a long time for somebody to be sort of dealing with the repeating stories and the rumination. That's one of the most damaging things, is the rumination and the repetition of stories. And you can translate that into the wider arena of conflicts. When you look at informal mediation, the power of informal mediation is that it's a process, not a procedure. And it's a process in the same way as bread making is a process. You take the ingredients and the quality of the bread depends on the recipe and the skill of the chef. But underpinning that is confidentiality and without prejudice. These are two incredibly important qualities of mediation. It means that people can try out ideas without feeling that they have made a commitment to one particular course of action. Okay, you can't take the information out of somebody's brain, but it still gives people that opportunity to speak freely. Anything's on the table, not just the claimant's claim, but anything's on the table. And even something that doesn't look like it might be particularly relevant, very often it's there because it has got some relevance, might not be capable of sorting out the mediation, but it's on the table. And anything is possible as an outcome if it is legal. The unique aspect of mediation, or one of the unique aspects, is that it gives you the opportunity to address the root causes, and those insights can be part of the agreement. Most of all, a time estimate for deciding to mediate to it being completed can be, well, 4 weeks. It could be 2 days, if you like, if you can find a mediator and get going. But let's say, for the purposes, 4 weeks. Less time for rumination, a greater feeling of involvement, a greater sense of control, however one describes a control, but it's not happening to them. You have to participate or not. Looking at the sort of understanding of conflict, this is an old model, but it still holds true. It's Galton's from 1969, and it's the ABC of conflict. Attitudes, reconciliation and healing, peace building. Behaviours, monitoring and enforcement, peacekeeping. Context, diplomatic intervention, peacemaking. Now, generally what happens is you get very good context, the diplomatic intervention, and you get very good monitoring and enforcement. But without the reconciliation and healing, the chances of a lasting peace are very, very much reduced. And whereas a mediator won't impose settlement on anybody, imposed peace doesn't feel like peace. And so the job of monitoring and enforcement takes over from the integration of new behaviours, which will allow people to maintain the peace. So, as I said at the beginning, people do not want peace imposed on them. They want a cessation of conflict, which will give them the opportunities to do what they want, look after their family, grow their crops, apply for jobs that they want to do, whatever. And the breadth of those choices are as different as the people who have them. Great. So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to this poem by Rumi. I love things that have been written a long, long time ago. A story is like water that you heat for your bath. It takes messages between the fire and your skin. It lets them meet and it cleans you. Very few can sit down in the middle of the fire itself, like a salamander or Abraham. We need intermediaries. So for a long time, we know we need intermediaries. And interestingly, the word mediator comes from the Greek mesites. And mesites was actually, way back in the time, a special kind of slave. And that slave was chosen for their personality traits and their particular demeanor, and they actually attracted a premium. This mesites, this particular slave, was actually brought into the household as the confidant of absolutely everyone, from the master and mistress of the house down to whoever else was in the house and the children. And there was just one rule: absolute confidentiality. And if that was broken, the penalty, when you can guess, can't you, was death. And I think that's an interesting part because, mediator appears in literature, particularly Christian literature, and is talked about very often, but that goes back a very long time. And when I learned that, it really embedded the importance of confidentiality and being alongside people and listening to them without judging. So I'm going to ask you we're going to take a little break before I go into the skills and attributes of mediators now that are complementary to those of a diplomat. I'd like you to watch this video. It's about a minute and a half, not very long. And I'd like you to watch the dot or follow the dot as it makes its journey. And at the end of it, I'm going to launch a poll and ask you what was your experience of watching this. And so if you're ready, the labyrinth is a very good symbol, and I'll talk a little bit more about that once you've watched it. So here we go. Okay. Bill, are you able to launch the poll? Or shall I stop the share?
I can try. I don't. Okay. Yes. Launching poll now, I think. People should be able to see it now, I think.
So when you were watching the movement of the dot, where were you looking? Has everybody voted that's going to vote?
Okay, shall I end the polling now for you,
Yeah.
Maggie? There you go. Can everyone see that then?
So we've got 44%, I was watching the dot itself, 32% a little ahead of the dot, and 24% quite a bit ahead of the dot. And nobody was behind the dot. So let's share the results, and that'll be in the chat. Can you see that? Now, there's a real purpose, as you might imagine, to this. First of all, I think we'll stop sharing now. I'll let me download so that we've got those. Right, so okay.
You want me to take it off screen for you?
Yeah, it should be off screen now. Right. So the purpose, the labyrinth, as it filled up, it's quite interesting. People being ahead or on the dot, or behind the dot, and actually, you know, quite a bit ahead of the dot, a bit ahead of the dot, and actually watching the dot. And the reason why I'm interested in that is because one of the most important parts of my view of being a mediator, and I say being a mediator as opposed to doing mediation, is that you turn up and you pay attention. And you pay attention to what's in front of you. And you also have to have a little bit of an eye on where you're going, but always coming back to where you are with these people and this problem at this time. And that's slightly different, or quite a lot different, from the goals of a diplomat who's working towards a specific goal. I choose the labyrinth because this sort of going back and forth, and you know, the small pieces, and then suddenly there's a great big sweep, and then it comes back, is that the patterns of our behavior in resolving conflict are very often like this. And you'll find people are making big strides, and then you go backwards. And we tend to go forwards and backwards, and then you get to the center, which is the goal. And then, unfortunately, you go much quicker backwards, but still in this back and forth way. So the labyrinth, for me, represents the pattern that we follow. And that allows us, as mediators, not to assume it's going to be like that, but to make allowances for the fact that people will go back on themselves before they go forward again and make progress. And our ability to stay with people and be patient with them while still maintaining momentum is a very important part of mediator skill set. So looking at the skills, in quite a few years ago now, I did an in-depth research project into the skills, attributes, behaviours of effective mediators. And interestingly, I reviewed something like 250 feedback forms to look at what people said about the process. And out of that, there was reams of really great words that described the experience. But out of those reams and reams of words, I think there was, I counted up to about 45 different words, and I'm not going to show them all of you, but there was this. This is what people said they valued about mediation: communication, experience, but not necessarily specific experience, just general experience of the process, of the arena, of in which the dispute was taking place. Identifying and progressing issues, being able to spot what this is about and check that. Being very good at keeping momentum. So hurry up slowly, one of my favourite slogans, which in Italian is festina lente. And keeping that sense of moving, but without hurrying people up to get to the end. Time spent at the beginning, invested in listening and sorting out and identifying the issues is time well spent. Being organised. Stamina, having stamina, that is a skill. Managing your energy is a skill which needs a lot of practice. So you are not flagging at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You might annoy people because you are managing your energy and looking bright and cheerful and everybody else is flagging, but maintaining your energy. Obtains common ground and confidently, quickly and confidently. Being able to identify where there is agreement, even if that's only about what time do we have lunch, and gets to the nub of the issues quickly and painlessly. So these are what people said, and these are skills in terms of ability to measure. What was more prevalent, and still is to this day, I believe, is the attributes and behaviours of a mediator. And effective mediators operate in a place where they are in two apparently conflicting states at the same time. So we are masters of paradox, and we have this kind of split brain arrangement where we are, for example, pragmatic and optimistic. We're firm but flexible, supportive but challenging, impartial, independent, I prefer, but alongside people. They have to feel that you are alongside, not on side, alongside. Sensitive, but having fairly quick, thick skin. Committed, but detached. Influential, but not influencing. Raising the eye line and bringing people down to earth. Creating stability, but mixing it. Directing the process, but following people at the pace they want to go, and helping them find the energy to keep going. Making things simple and revealing the complexity of the issues that you are dealing with. Simplifying things and bringing them down to real, sort of very simple, can be very, very dispiriting to people who believe that their issues are very complex. Being tough and empathetic, and being informed or authoritative, or natural authority, but curious and wanting to understand at the same time. And this is what we do. And we do all that, and we remain a consistent and reliable source that people can navigate towards and rely on, to keep a handle on the tiller. There are many more, but I thought those, and it's and, not but. The principles of mediation, well, there's confidentiality on 2 levels. That is the mediation itself and any private conversations that we have with people. The authority that people are there that can make a decision. And taking it into the wider field of, more generalized conflict, community conflict, you still need the people with authority there, whatever that authority is. Responsibility, encouraging people to take responsibility for decision making, encouraging appropriate behaviour, consummate respect in all circumstances, even under intense provocation. It's sometimes a challenge, but giving that sense that that's your expectation. That's being influential, if you like. The process is voluntary, not compelled to settle. You might have to go to mediation, and this is in any context, but you're not compelled to settle. Non-judgmental, that's what the mediator is. You are assisting in decision making. Because if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I was talking about imposed peace, imposed settlement. It tends not to last. And the same happens in commercial or civil mediation. Non-binding, until agreed by the parties, written down and signed. And that a mediator is neutral, independent, but is actively so, supportive and even-handed. And sometimes we have to go the extra mile to show the even-handedness. And I think that's quite difficult for a diplomat who's a state actor to do that, because those elements are particularly challenging if they're representing the state. Nevertheless, not even if they want to achieve a peace accord. And it's at that aspect that there's a sort of parallel, a partnership, where a mediator can actually do that part of it in the peace building process. I've talked about being mediator. Well, you turn up and pay attention to what you have, these people, this problem right now. And the main activity is deep listening, and to keep listening. And even if people repeat themselves, you know, sometimes you have to listen and then help them move on by summarizing or actually giving them a sense that you've got it, or that the others have got it. Because that deep listening, that practice, reaches the part of human beings that allows them to make peace with themselves inwardly and peace outwardly. And that is a very important part of the peace building process. Don't judge. We're careful of language, of opinions, of sharing personal experience. And I think that's something that you kind of feel your way through. It depends. Sometimes your personal experience will be very, very valuable, and sometimes it won't. The next two might surprise you. Gentleness, real gentleness. That tone, that it's not softness in terms of, you know, mediation is not a cuddly event, it's tough. Anybody who's been through it will tell you that it's exhausting. But it's that gentleness, because behind the gentleness is always confidence. Behind the gentleness is a sense of making time to hear people get to where they need to be in order for them to say yes, whether that's in a corporate dispute, civil dispute, or even restorative justice, or in the wider international field. So as I said, a diplomat is a state actor, and it's very important in terms of setting the context. That's the C in the APC. The mediator is the peace builder who can actually get to the people and help them develop the capacity to hear what they might not want to hear, but might actually need help in order to move forward. So I've got quite a few stories about, you know, how this is played out, and one of them, this is a carver bowl from Fiji, and this was a gift that was given to me at the end of a 4-day extremely challenging mediation, which involved, I can talk about it as well because it was actually reported in the papers. It involved somewhere in the region, I think it was about 40 lawyers, but half of them had been under house arrest the previous week at the instructions of the Attorney General. It involved the Attorney General and the Minister of Commerce. The Minister of Commerce, there'd been an assassination attempt on him the previous week. The government at the time had gain power through a coup. So there was, a lot of anger and resentment and difficulty going on. But the actual dispute was a commercial dispute about the telecoms, the breakup of the telecoms monopoly. But wrapped up in this telecoms deal, which you might say, well, EAG telecoms, yes, huge centre for telecoms. The Southern Cross comes straight down, and it's the landing. And so the land rights, property issues, pensions, unions were involved. The parties that were completely involved in this were vast numbers of parties. And as I said, about 40 lawyers. I have no idea how I was going to keep these lawyers entertained, amused, or occupied until I had this bright idea. And that was, I'd asked them to start drafting the agreement. And you imagine them looking at me and saying, Amanda, you must be bonkers. Right? What do you mean start writing the agreement? Well, I said, well, if you start writing the agreement that you think is going to work, then as you go through it with your colleagues, because I wanted them all to work on it, as you go through it with your colleagues, it will raise issues that need to be taken back to the main room and, bottomed out. Well, they got that, so they started. And it worked like that. As soon as they came up with sort of issues, they were taken back for discussion. It was supposed to last 2 days, but it actually lasted 4 days. And during that time, an awful lot happened. At the beginning of mediation, I was waiting to woman handle everybody into the main meeting room. And there were these 8 very large Fijian types, were very large men, looking, I don't know, they were just standing there. I went up to them and I said, excuse me, gentlemen, would you mind moving into the lobby? Because I'm just about to start a private meeting here, and this area is generally closed off. At that point, one of the guys lifted up his shirt, which of course was a bit surprising, lifted up his shirt and tucked into the top of his skirt waistband was a pistol, Glock. I know it was a Glock. It turned out it was a bodyguard detail for the variety of people, but they didn't look to me like they were paying great attention. But that was the sort of context in which this was taking. And also during the mediation, there was an attempt by various people to impeach the most senior judge in the land. So that we had to take a break in order to deal with that. But at the end of it all, despite the complexities, the political nature, the vast sums of money, $5 billion US dollars at the time, it possibly could have been more because of the property values and pension fund issues. But at the end of it all, there was this agreement, and I knew that we needed to mark this in some way. And I'd seen this bowl in the hotel lobby, and I went to find the manager, and I said, excuse me, I said, would you mind very much, could I borrow the bowl? And he said, yes, of course, ma'am, of course, they can do enough for me, really. Yes, of course. I filled it with spring water, with Fiji water, absolutely wonderful. And I went out into the garden. I picked up frangipani blossoms from underneath the tree, and I put them in the bowl. And then I walked into the mediation room, all these guys sitting around the table waiting to sign this agreement. And I walked in and I put this bowl in the middle of the table. They were arguing quite ferociously as I walked in, but as soon as I put that bowl on the table, peace descended, a peaceful sense. And that symbolism and that sort of, didn't have kava in it. I'm sure at some point they would be drinking kava out of a bowl, but that was a step too far for me. But it was that moment of connection between them, and to remember what this was about. This was about the people of Fiji and safeguarding their rights, and not riding roughshod over that, as indeed, the year previously had proved to be the case. And I was given it, and I brought it back to England, and it was one of my most treasured. What I like about it, it's the 4 corners, the 4 cardinal points. And those cardinal points are mother of pearl. And what is quite interesting is that I think we have, and there's evidence of this, we have really underused the power of women in their capacity to build peace. And there are so few peace accords where women are at the table. And I was reminded of my hero, or heroine, although we don't say that these days, hero, Momola, and her capacity to connect with people on a deeply human level, to be very humble and to always keep the focus on what mattered. Yes, she made mistakes. Yes, it didn't always go according to plan, but she really engaged with people. If she was having a high-level meeting with Martin McGuinness and others, she'd be the one at the coffee table, pouring the coffee and offering the biscuits. And that hosting, that welcoming, that being part of looking after, that to me is a very, very important part of mediation. Connecting with people on a deeply human level, allowing them to speak freely without being judged, however difficult that might be, and listening to where they want to get to, and challenging them about the realities of that and how they're going to do it. That's where we, I believe, do our best work. And we rely on diplomats to create the political context. Sometimes they use us and sometimes they don't, but I believe that there is a partnership there, which is 1 and 1 makes many, many more. So I've got more stories, but I just would like to hand back to you and see if you've got any questions, or Bill, if anything has come to mind for you.
Well, I'll just maybe kick off very briefly. I'm sure people have got questions, Amanda. Thank you so much. The kava ball, that's a Samoan, something of Samoan origin, isn't it? Is that?
Well, it's Fijian and Samoan, and it's actually in Hawaii, it's kind of widespread, but that particular boat is a Fijian one.
Yeah. Right. So just what you're saying about imposed solutions are not durable. I mean, why do we get imposed solutions? Is that government sending diplomats with a predetermined outcome and just getting them to enforce that outcome rather than going to negotiations with open minds? Is that the problem, do you think?
I think that's part of it, and I think that it's a consideration. I'm very reluctant to be absolute about anything, because life has told me that there are no absolutes. But generally speaking, there must be an agenda. There must be a purpose. When you're a state actor and you're appointed by the state, then you have a kind of political remit. And so, yes, and if you have that in mind, then everything, you're going to be subject to confirmation bias. You're looking for information that's confirming where you're going. And, a lot of things in that way. And so, yes, I think it gets in the way. One of the things that a practice mediator who knows that this kind of approach works, because there are mediators who can be quite evaluative, but generally speaking, hands-off guidance. And what is it that these people can say yes to, right? What is it that these people can say yes to? Because I don't know what's in their heads. I don't know what it is. I don't know the complexities, but I do know the complexities of the human mind in this sort of invisible set of scales that we have in our heads about, you know, what's fair, what's not fair, and what do I actually want. So that's, to me, is the sort of undercover, not secret, but the sort of gentle, egoless role of a mediator complements the very much more elite and powerful role that a diplomat might have. And they can achieve certain things, but they certainly can't achieve in the same way what we can achieve.
Interesting, thank you. Shall we open up the floor then, if anyone's got any other questions then? Or comments or observations?
We'll look in the chat.
Look in the chat. Yeah, I mean, by all means, please put something in the chat or just...
There's a question here.
Oh.
How did I get into mediation? That's from Natasha Bissett. My father was chief prosecutor in the Kenya police during the time of Mama. And my mother was a nurse that was in Nairobi. And my father was a very, very good prosecutor, and he got extremely uncomfortable about how successful he was in getting convictions. The British government were quite happy about that, but he wasn't. And so he started to go out and talk to anybody and negotiated significant numbers of amnesties where Africans came in and surrendered their arms and effectively became prisoners of war. And this was really, you know, I didn't know that story quite in that detail, but I grew up in a family where my father was facts and evidence, but an unbelievable, brilliant negotiator. And my mother was all about people and feelings because she was a nurse and she was a pediatric nurse to boot. And so from a very early age, I was actually mediating. I remember my first mediation at 4.5. No, mummy, daddy doesn't mean that. No, daddy, mummy doesn't mean that. I do remember that. But I started out and wanted to become a lawyer, and something made me fall off the wagon, as it were. I did the degree, and then I just decided that I enjoyed the negotiating more. And I went into being a zinc broker, and I managed the production of 2 zinc smelters, and that brought me into contact with an awful lot of people around the world. And because of the ore and the metals and the associated, it brought me into contact with serious conflict in the areas in which these metals were mined. And it called me to evaluate, you know, the company that I was working for. And I had a brilliant career there. And then all my team were disappearing. And so I thought, well, I think I want to do something else. And I think I might like to do something a bit more creative, because I'm a bit of an artist. So I went to be the marketing director of a tannery. Now, how do you do that? Too long a story, but it is the same sort of things. Environmental issues, a very established workforce, lots of conflict, lots of difficulty, and the skins were coming from areas of significant conflict. And that was not as enjoyable. And at the end of those 2 things, I bemoaned the fact that relationships and the capacity to work out problems was better in the first absolutely horrendous and had taken to nearly bankruptcy. And I thought, I'm quite good at this sort of negotiating, helping people find. I wonder if there's something I can do with that. And that's when I discovered the world of mediation. I did my training. I'd already been doing a kind of bit of conflict resolution, but I didn't know that I was doing it. And I trained and I walked out of my training, and I've never done anything else since. Although I've done lots of different things. So that's how I became a mediator.
Some other very interesting observations there. I think one question, which I think we know the answer to really, do you need to be a lawyer? Do you want to comment on whether lawyers are the best mediators or not?
Well, that's a different question. That's a very different question. My legal training and my keeping up with the law and my real appreciation of how important it is helps me enormously. But I never use it in terms of mediating. That's not my style. I do use it to ask difficult questions, and I am a nerd when it comes to reading decisions, because I think some of the decisions are just fascinating. But no, I don't. I think it's helpful to be a lawyer to actually make a career, because I think the perception of the myth out there is you have to be a lawyer in order to be a mediator. And I think it's helpful in that regard. But do you have to be a lawyer to be a mediator? No, you don't. You don't. Knowledge of the law, because it is part of the process of access to justice. Mediation is very much about access to justice, but it says, please try and sort your problems out yourself, because you might not like what somebody else tells you to do by way of those decisions.
Well, the floor is still open, everyone, for a little while longer.
Hello, Bill.
Hello there, Michael. Good evening.
Yeah, how are you?
All right, thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Yeah, Amanda, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd be interested in your views of the performance, or good or otherwise, of sometimes people who one might call celebratory mediator, diplomats, politicians, or whatever, who occasionally get involved, sometimes very publicly, in the resolution of disputes. Perhaps like the Pakistani High Commissioner to Kuala Lumpur, who I had the privilege of training as a mediator once, to Malaysia, I had the privilege of training, perhaps as a mediator in Kuala Lumpur. Perhaps more diplomats could benefit from being trained as mediators. And also, that was my first question. The other point I was just wondering was what your view was, whether we should actually start thinking about talking about resolution rather than justice, because justice has this almost adversarial connotation. So I'd be interested in your views on those couple of points. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Amanda.
Right. What is my view on celebrity mediators? Well, it depends. Because you see, if you talk about somebody like Mo Molam, I'd say fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But if you talk about somebody like Tony Blair, or I can't think of any, it depends what their agenda is, and they have agendas, and unless they are skilled at putting those aside, then there is going to get in the way. And whether it's real or not, the perception that there is a reason for this intervention. There are some times when people, celebrity mediators do get, and they're the only people who get in the room. So do I say, well, don't use them, use somebody else if they're the only people who get in the room? No, I don't. I think my concern is that you do have a very serious job when you are a mediator, and there has to be a level of, to my mind, there has to be a level of humility and deep respect for other people's lives. And I'm not sure that is necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. It might be. It might be. So I'd have to see them in action, I think. I'd have to see them in action, and I would know within about 5 minutes. And your second question, what was your second question, Michael?
Yeah, it's just whether we should usefully talk in all sorts of contexts about resolution rather than justice, because justice has adversarial connotations of revenge and punishment and justification, or some of the concepts actually that you mentioned when you were talking.
Well, I don't often talk about justice. I think in this instance, I was talking about people's expectations of having access to justice. And restorative justice is another area. But generally speaking, I don't talk about justice, because I think people's perception of what that actually is so varied, and also the lack of understanding about what is possible and what the state can deliver and what that might feel like. That is really way off, and it's got worse, not better, in the last 5-10 years. And you can see that from the rantings on social media, and actually some of our politicians who are trained as lawyers have made awful mistakes about justice and what's achievable and not. So it's a word I choose very carefully to use. But that's what people say they want. I want justice. And then you have to unravel, well, what is that? It's sometimes a euphemism for revenge, quite simply.
You want to come back on that, Michael? No?
No, I don't think so. I think that also, I think it's interesting your observation about how in a typical mediation, the parties get time off for good behaviour, because you go and talk to the other ones, one-on-ones, and you have to combine somehow energy, stamina, and also patience, and that's I certainly find, I don't know whether you find the same thing, 24 hours later or something like that, if you've had a day or more than one day of mediation, I crash and burn quite badly. So you do put an awful lot into it.
You do put an awful lot, and I certainly I do have this capacity to manage my energy. So even if it's 8 o'clock at night, I'm still present. What happens the next day? Well, I don't want to speak to anybody, quite frankly, because I'm too busy processing, what I've learned. But every case is an extraordinary opportunity to build on my understanding and appreciation of what people are facing today. And the increase in fear is palpable for all kinds of reasons. And working with people who are extremely fearful of the future, of annihilation, in their terms of losing everything they had, there is a real sense in the moment that that's the less sense of being able to pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and start again. And I think that's kind of, I see my role as being turning up and being a witness actually, a witness to this, these difficult problems wherever they are, and to do what I can to make that a better place to be. The end results are often about sharing pain. I know everybody talks about mediation being win-win. I'm not a fan of that. I think it can be. When it is, it's fabulous. But it's successful when each side recognizes the other has felt some pain. And that's quite hard sometimes to be with.
Some other interesting comments, Amanda. One of the things that people are raising is this access to justice. I mean, what if you've got a party that there really is an imbalance of power and you really think the other party is being taken completely advantage of? Is there a point where the mediator should get involved if it's a really unconscionable agreement and somebody's really resolving something and it's completely unfair? Is it the mediator's job to step in there, or is it the mediator's job to stay removed from that, do you think?
This mediator would be quite attentive to making sure or to exploring why that particular agreement was being considered. And I'm saying those words here might be different if I was actually doing that job. But it's not my job to sanction or otherwise the agreements. And I said in my presentation, it's very much about if it's legal. But if I saw that balance of power and I saw that difficult, I have ways of exploring that, which would bring it to attention. And I'd be quite persistent in making sure that the risk assessment had been done, the consequences were understood, and what the alternatives were to that, which is kind of helping that person make a case for why they're prepared to agree to something which to everybody else looks like a bad deal.
Interesting, thank you. Well, any other thoughts or comments? We've still got the chat box open, obviously, if anyone wants to put anything in there or put their hand up electronically or just shout out.
I think one of the things about access to justice, and I know that Michael's pulled me up on this, but I've just seen comments in the chat box. Everybody has the right to bring a complaint and to have it heard. But sometimes the way that might play out has a greater risk attached to it of not being helpful than sitting down and talking with your opponent about the problem. And the thing about mediation is people raise the issues about it being done confidentially and not being reported, and that somehow it diminishes the value of precedent and developing case law. And I get that. However, I don't know how many people there are out there who are prepared to pay the price, not just the money price, but to pay the price of making that case. And in the absence of legal aid, in order to do that, sometimes cases that really should come to court and have a decision for the benefit of the rest of us don't, simply because the very people who are suffering those injustices do not have access to the funds in order to bring them. So there's already an imbalance, a power imbalance, which a lot of people find, sort of quite offensive. So when I look at that and I think about what mediation offers people, I see it like this. It allows people to make a choice for themselves. I say negotiation is for grown-ups. Mediation is for grown-ups who've got themselves in a corner and need some help getting out of it. And litigation is for the insane. It costs £25,000 to get into court these days on something other than a small claim. So, it's already difficult. And this is about giving people the opportunity to take responsibility, because when you have that deep listening, when you have that deep attention to that person in their situation with their problem, then you are helping them come to terms with something which perhaps just can't be changed. And that, to me, is a very, very important role.
Actually, I'm sorry, Bill, if I may, I entirely agree with Amanda. I've always thought it rather strange that the great British and indeed international public should pay a huge amount of money for the development of the common law. And, I've always thought that a very, very strange idea. But there we are. It's one that's peddled by people who are a lot cleverer than me all the time.
Yes, well, I had a case which was actually a commercial lease case, and it was absolutely it was a fascinating case, a fascinating point in law, and it really should have gone to court, and it should have been appealed, and it should have gone all the way up, because there would have been a vast swathe of people who would have benefited from the decision, whatever it was, either way. The difficulty about that is as the commercial parties who were determined to see this through said to me, why should I spend £250,000? Why should we spend £250,000 on making it better for everybody else? I can't argue with that. Is that a good use of shareholder funds? Is that a good use of somebody's pension fund? I don't know, but I think one day soon, we're going to have to face up to what that is. I believe that mediation offers people a chance, seriously, in the hands of good mediators, to make a decision which actually reconciles them to the SH1T that happens in life.
And we've got I suppose there's wider remedies with mediation as well, aren't there?
Yeah.
There will be cases where you need court, but there's so many wider options, creative settlements, aren't there, that the judge just doesn't have the power to order.
And one of the worst things that ever happened to mediation, and I have said this, and with Bill still on the call, and Michael will have heard me say, the worst thing ever happened was alternative dispute resolution. How to commit marketing suicide, right? Call it alternative. I remember, sorry,
please go on. Please go
no,
on.
but it's not alternative. It's actually part of the dispute resolution landscape. And it means that if you don't succeed at mediation, or you don't get a settlement at mediation, it doesn't stop you from going, well, the only thing is people say it adds a level of cost. But that cost is often recoverable. I don't mean in the cost sense, but I mean recoverable in terms of narrowing the issues, being clear about what it is you want to do, being clear about all kinds of things. It can be a really useful part of the process.
I've never seen this before. We've actually got more people coming in as we speak.
I know.
More
Ian,
people
you've got your hand up.
Yeah,
yes, we've got.
thanks. Well, Amanda, I've been meaning to come in for a while. I've been prompted by your last remark, because rather strangely at the moment, I'm actually working for the Ministry of Justice. We didn't used to have a Ministry of Justice, did we? It was just the Home Office and the Lord Chancellor's Department. So I think it was the Tony Blair government in its wisdom that decided we needed a Ministry of Justice. And I agree with everything that's being said about the tension between the concept of justice on the one hand, which is represented by that symbol, Lady Justice, who's blindfolded and holds the scales in one hand and the sword in the other. There's this element of being, held to account and taken to justice, it being done to someone. And resolution, which is symbolized by the handshake. That's the kind of, you search online for resolution, that's the image that comes up. And I think the only way to square it is, as you've described, through this notion of access to justice and other forms of resolution, non-court resolution, being part of a wider meaning of the notion of access to justice. But I just wanted to say, in relation to ADR, one of the early wins that I've had at the MOJ is to get ministers to accept that we need to drop the A from ADR. So the Lord Chancellor's made a couple of speeches recently in which he has actually said these are no longer to be viewed as alternative processes, but they're to be integrated into the justice system. So we are making progress on this, but I think of course the whole access to justice phrase, which stemmed from Lord Wolfe's report back in 1996, is so entrenched. It's so entrenched in the mindset of the public, in government thinking. It's very hard to get outside of it. So I think only through that kind of understanding that there are different meanings, different routes to justice, and that resolution is one, probably the more important element of it. Can you kind of reconcile those things? So thank you for what you've said.
No, you're very welcome. And it is resolution, and it is an acceptance that we all, as citizens, need to step up and solve our problems. And if we can't, then there is the court to help do that. It cannot be argued too cogently that sometimes your opponent is hopeless and will not engage in anything and will not come to the table, or even if they do come to the table, just sit there and say nothing. I say that's quite rare. I think it's quite rare. And I have people saying to me, I don't want to sit in the same room as that person, I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do that. And it's being alongside them and saying, I am here. I will not allow the process to deteriorate in the way that will make you feel, particularly threatened. And I've had one or two mediations where somebody has behaved appallingly, and they have had very short shrift from me, and you can see them laughing, and they didn't do it again. Which included one appalling behaviour where I smacked my hand on the table so hard I actually hurt myself, but you did not see that on my face. You did not see. And the other time was when an accountant who was an expert witness came over the table at me and was like here spitting and screaming at me because he was out of money. He was worried he wasn't going to get paid his very large expert bill on time, and my response to that was to move back very, 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 very slowly, put my hands on the table like that, and to actually meet him and come back across the table like that, folks. And it worked, but I couldn't tell you that that would work every time. And that's what I mean by it depends. Your rock, your backbone, your sense of why you're doing it. And the minute you take responsibility for judging the person, the issue, you lose your center point, your center of gravity. And you lose your ability, in my view, to be of deep and meaningful service to those people who need help out of their black hole.
Just looking at the chat again, Amanda, and just conscious of time a little bit. Someone's asking, could you explain your use of the cava bowl? Why did it work? Did it work in the way you expected? And then there's another question about, is it better to mediate the small stuff rather than go into the big issues first? Or do the big issues take over? And perhaps that's two separate questions, but just for time reasons, can we maybe try and cover those?
Yes, I had a sense the carver bowl would work. I'm very interested in culture and practices and symbolism and ritual. And ritual is a really deep human need to have those rituals. And it is how we connect with our fellow man, ritual. And so the whole carver bowl ritual is about welcome and sharing and celebration. And there are many reasons why the carver bowl sort of comes into play. And there's a vast range of styles which denotes whether it's a royal or it's a social thing. And I did have it because I had spent 4 days with these people, understanding and talking and finding out about things. And yes, I did have a strong sense that that symbolism, and I think I had a sense of a woman bringing the carver bowl into the room. But I didn't know that it was going to have such a positive effect. I just had a nose that it was kind of the way to wrap this up with a little bit of ceremony, because signing the mediation agreement is a ceremony. And I always like to get people to sign the agreement to mediate in person, because that's a kind of physical commitment to this document that says, I'm here in good faith. I might behave badly. I might behave very badly. But I did tell you, Amanda, I was going to arrive in good faith. I was going to participate in good faith. And I remind them. And so that was the carver bowl. And then the other question was?
The other one was, is it sometimes better to mediate the small stuff rather than go into the big issues first, or to do the big issues and do the big issues take over during the mediation?
Well, I think that presupposes that the big stuff might be the big stuff and the small stuff might be the small stuff, when in my experience, the big stuff is often the small stuff and the small stuff is often the big stuff. So,
right. Interesting, yes.
Well, first of all, and again, I can't bear to say things always, but the papers, the dispute is very rarely what the papers say it is about. That's been my experience. Sometimes there's something else going on. Sometimes there's something that actually underpins the whole thing, which is small stuff. I think that's actually about listening to people and getting them to tell you what it is about. And very often, and this is why it's so important not to interrupt anybody, because the last thing they say is often the most important.
And I suppose if you're looking at the court papers, the statements of case and so on, that's very legalistic. I mean, that's looking at the legal arguments, whereas once you drill into it, maybe going below the surface, the big issues are something else. They are issues that are not pleaded in the statements of case, but other things going on there.
Well, it's an important point there, because when you have an experience and then you repeat it to somebody else, you place the filter on making yourself look better than perhaps you were in terms of contribution to the problem. You then, they encourage you to say you must do something about it, you know, sue or whatever. You go and see a solicitor, and they then start to put the filter of what is possible. How do I frame this particular event in the best possible way in order to make a decent claim that has the best chance of succeeding? And then you have another repetition of another filter, and maybe after a period of time, you actually end up preparing for trial. And at that point, you'll get a barrister who puts another filter on the story that started quite a long time ago. And so when you get to that point, what you have is something which has been man or woman handled into something that's likely to make a case that will win. And so I bear that in mind when papers come to me, and I think, I wonder what's going on here. Not there is something going on here, but I wonder what's going on here. It'd be interesting to hear the backstory to that. I've got some questions about that. And parties are often relieved to be able to put right the slant that has been put on necessarily and by good people who are only out to do the best for their clients.
Interesting. One very quick question here. Were there any women at the Fiji mediation?
Absolutely, categorically not. No, there weren't. There were no women around the table. I was definitely novelty value.
Interesting, isn't it? Yes. Well, there are a few other questions here. So someone is asking about written and signed agreements. Do you need a court order? Well, I think I'm probably right in saying you would need a court order if proceedings had been issued, I suppose.
Well, you submit the Tomlin order or consent order, but otherwise it's just a contract like any other contract. And if it's broken, it can be, you know, sued. You can sue on the breach of contract.
Indeed. I've got one. I'm just conscious of time. I've got one other question here.
They'll go if they don't want to stay.
They will go. They will indeed. Yeah. I've got one from Justin Glass, who's been instrumental in the European Atlantic Group for many years. How far does Amanda see a big difference between political, legal, and personal mediation? There is obviously an overlap in terms of life experience and how to deal with complex situations. Is it fair to say that the political idea, the art of the impossible, is in most cases the crux underlying idea? That's our final question in the chat box.
Right.
How far do you see a difference between political, legal, and personal?
Well, I think it's the dynamics between the elements of A, B, and C, actually. And I think that's the mix that needs to be tailor-made to the particular conflict, whether that's a personal or interpersonal conflict, or whether it's a nation-state conflict. So at every level, there is always going to be the context, the political context, whether that's political state or whether that's political corporate or whether that's actually political civil in terms of something being at odds with the politics of the day, right? I then think that the sort of the behaviour part of it is very much about our societal approach and what we will tolerate. And, you know, our capacity for tolerating behaviours waxes and wanes. And at the moment, there's quite a big divide, and you've got this real anger amongst people about, you know, calling people out. So, for example, very little tolerance for, say, legal aid that's given to so-called illegal immigrants. You know, that shouldn't happen. or legal aid given to people who are alleged terrorists. And those are societal things, because actually the law of the land is very clear, and the Human Rights Act is very clear, and there is no argument. But the way in which that is manipulated creates more problems for conflict resolution, actually. The ignorance or the willful disregard of the facts by our politicians make it much more difficult to be clear about the opportunities. So when you say what's the difference between them, I say the mix of dynamics, or the emphasis that's placed on context, that is the elite, and I use that word wisely, which includes ambassadors, the state, the people with invested power to make those changes, to make those offers. And then the behaviours, which is the culture that underpins, and how to change behaviour to support lasting peace, whether that's a civil, commercial, or nation state problem. And that's where I see it. So I think making differences and calling it this mediation or that mediation, or it's unhelpful. It's unhelpful to people's understanding of the responsibility, if you possibly can, to confront the issues, talk about them and resolve them. And to do that, if you can't do it yourself, with the help of an independent third party. That dynamic is incredibly powerful. That third person generates huge energy and will get people much further than they will get on their own. We have a huge job to do as mediators, and I feel very privileged, because I'm very fortunate that I found this way, but it is very tough. People say to me, how the hell do you live conflict every day? And that's building that capacity to be very committed and detached. And I will say to people, I really, really, really want to help you get to a solution. And I totally respect your right to blow yourself up if you want.
Very interesting. Well, I'm afraid we can't all go for drinks and discuss it further. I'm just conscious of time. One last call for any final question, if Amanda's prepared to take another one, and then I think perhaps we'll
I think you're all fantastic the way you've stuck with me, and that was me worrying that you might not like what I had to say.
It's been a great, Amanda. Thank you so much. So I'm so grateful to you for doing this, and so grateful to everyone for turning up. Perhaps we can all electronically show our thanks to Amanda, either electronically or applauding by remote. Oh, yes, that's right.
You're very kind.
That's the one, if I can find it. Reactions. Yes, yes, yes.
Well,
there you go.
Great.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, and so thank you so very much, and for all your time and effort in this, Amanda. And I know with all your experience and everything else, it's been, something else for you to do, and you've put time into it for us, so we're extremely grateful. Thank you so much.
Very welcome, and I wish you all a fantastic weekend, and I hope I prodded the little grey cells, and should anybody have pushback or an argument or something to add, you can find me on, like, if you just Google me, you'll find my website or my email address.
And can we make your slides available as well to everyone?
Would you like them?
Might be useful, actually. Yeah, if you don't mind, we can probably try and send them on.
Okay, please. So that's Naveed. Where are you? Yes, there you are, Naveed.
Sorry?
There is Naveed Khan has said he would like them.
Okay. Right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. I wish you a fantastic evening and a very relaxing weekend. And be gentle because behind the gentleness is always confidence.
That's a good thought to go with. Well, thank you again, Amanda, and thank you so much, everyone, for turning up. And please keep your eye on the European Atlantic Group website. We will be having other events.
Okay.
Going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Bye, Justin. Bye, Tabitha.